Okay, morning. My name is Dan Gottleib. I'm the technical lead for a project called SMART Health IT, which is a joint effort of Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School around creating an app platform for healthcare. It's an open source effort, so all the code we do is released as open source. Everything we work on is open standards. And I wanted to talk about a project that we started just a little under a year ago, really getting in, towards the end of last year, around extending the FHIR API to support population-level data sets. And we're working on this in conjunction with HL7, as well as the FHIR community and the Argonaut community. So it's an open project. Everything I'm going to describe is a work in progress. So a lot of these standards are still a little bit in flux, and I just updated the slides with changes to the spec from a few weeks ago. So we're definitely looking for input and for people to participate at the FHIR Connectathons and on Zulip and on our GitHub repository. And so to start, I wanted to talk about kind of some of the background, some of the reason for this work and for this specification. And I wanted to begin with three examples that came up in projects I've been working on. One was with a large academic medical center that wanted to sync progress notes from a third-party clinic into the academic medical center. So for one research study, patients were getting most of their care from this healthcare system, but some care from a third-party clinic. And they wanted to be able to pull data from that EHR that clinic was running into the EHR at the academic medical center. And the way they did this was to do a nightly CSV export from that third-party EHR, FTP it into the health systems network, and then do an ETL, a load process, to convert that CSV into a format that the EHR could handle and load it in. And this works, but as you can imagine, it's pretty brittle. So if either EHR changes their data format, you have to do work to fix this interface. And it's very custom, so it's time-consuming to implement and to design. Similarly, a similar situation came up with a care management system within a healthcare organization. They purchased a commercial care management system and wanted to load it with data from their EHR and periodically update that so that care managers could see other parts of the patient information. And to do that, they did a CSV export from the EHR. There was no FTP because it was all within the network. But then the care management company had to do a custom mapping, as they do with most of their customers, to be able to import that data into their database. Again, not a smooth or easy process. And then the last example was actually a machine learning startup that was working with a provider group. The provider group had a cloud EHR that supported FHIR, so they were able to pull down FHIR data. But this machine learning startup wanted to update their model with the patient population for this provider group. So they wanted to pull all the information about all the patients that were in this cloud EHR. And so to do so, they used the FHIR API, but they had to do hundreds of thousands of FHIR requests to pull all the data. What they realized was actually kind of funny, that the patient's records were consecutive numbers. So they just looped through and tried all the different numbers for all the different resources and saw what came down. And so this was, again, like a very brittle process. And they told me they were terrified about when they have to update their model again with new data, because it was hugely time consuming and things kept timing out and breaking. And so while it worked, it wasn't really ideal for pulling data on this large population. And there are a lot of other use cases. One use case that the federal government in the US, the Office of the National Coordinator, is really interested in is enabling payers, and in this case, insurance companies and employers who pay for healthcare, to assess the quality of the healthcare that their constituents are receiving. And so they really want a way to be able to get a data set on all the care that all the people in their plan or in their system have received. And then the other side is also true. So healthcare providers at clinical organizations want to be able to get data from payers on claims for that patient, to get a 360-degree view of care that patient may have received outside of their care network. So they want a bulk pull of kind of all the claims for all the patients that their providers are seeing. And then a use case that's come up at my healthcare institution at Boston Children's Hospital is around an internal data warehouse that's used for research purposes. So we regularly dump data from clinical systems into the research database. It's I2B2 based to identify study cohorts and do analytics for healthcare quality. And then the last use case is around disease reporting, submitting to national registries. In a lot of cases, registries have custom data formats, and again, you're in this CSV mapping process where you have to kind of create an output file for each registry for often a large patient population and then upload it. And so that's another instance where it's kind of this cumbersome process. So what it comes down to is, these CSV exports are slow. There's proprietary work on each time to map the data into each system. The actual triggering of the exports is manual. So most healthcare systems are using a commercial provider to kind of kick off these export operations or these ETL operations. And that's different at each healthcare institution often. Or some places have a business analyst who just clicks a button on Tuesdays to kind of kick off those data processes, which is also somewhat error prone. And then the last point is that the FHIR API is incredible for kind of small queries, and the data model is really good. But when you're trying to pull data on thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of patients, it breaks down a little bit because it's for two reasons. It's synchronous, so each request that goes to the server waits for the server to come back, which ties up the server. And really, you want to be running that as like a background process rather than in your transactional FHIR flow. And then the results are often paged, where you might get 50 FHIR resources at a time, but really you want all the FHIR resources for that patient, which could be hundreds, or you want all for all patients, which could be millions. And so that just adds a lot of HTTP requests that are going back and forth, a lot of traffic. So the idea of this project is really pretty simple. FHIR is incredible. It's got hundreds of thousands of person hours of really good informaticists thinking about these problems. How can we apply this to these custom CSV exports that everybody's doing? So we want to use the FHIR data model instead of custom fields, again, at each point. We want to use the FHIR API, the operations function capability, specifically to kick off these transactions, so it's not different at every healthcare institution. And then we want to leverage standard security models like the SMART backend services OAuth profile to have that work the same way everywhere too. And the neat thing is that if you have a standard API, you don't have to build everything into one system. It kind of enables this idea of pipelines where, one question early on that came up was, are you going to have de-identification as a parameter in your export API? And the nice thing is that with a bulk data API, you can have kind of a standard de-identification transformation that can plug into all kinds of clinical systems and data warehouses by reading with the bulk API and then providing that API. And you can have different vendors create different de-identification transformations that maybe have different priorities in terms of the capabilities that they're exposing. Another really common use case that we expect that's in ETL of clinical data is around recoding data. So if you have an internal medication code that you're using within your health system, but when you export the data, you want the medications to be coded in RxNorm, you can build that once and then be able to apply that transformation on anything that uses a bulk data API. And then another use case that's pretty common is around encrypting the data as it flows out. And so kind of with all these use cases, the bulk data API enables standard software components instead of monolithic systems. And so in thinking about this problem, we had a few design goals. The first is that we wanted to enable automated communication between backend services and EHR clinical systems. So the idea is that after the initial setup, there shouldn't need to be a user involved to kind of log in and kick off the process, but you should be able to have these systems just talk to each other on a regular basis and do things like nightly data exports. So one of the important goals here was really to get this into real-world use as fast as possible. And so to support that, we wanted to use mature, stable technologies. So we really focused around this file-based transfer because that's what people are doing today, and that's what infrastructure supports today. I think down the road, we'll want to look at some of the streaming technologies and subscriptions and other ways of kind of integrating systems for bulk data. But in the short term, we want to make it easy to kind of slot into how systems work. And for the same reason, we really tried to keep the API surface area small and figure out kind of what's the minimum set of capabilities we can support that would really cover use cases that people need to handle today. As I mentioned, there's been so much great work on FHIR. We want to reuse as much of that as possible. Same with kind of the authentication and authorization standards. But we want to add the ability to do to work with large data sets. And so that's asynchronous operation, what I mentioned before, being able to put in a request, let a server grind on it for a few hours, poll periodically to see if it's done, and then get a notification when it's complete, so that you don't have to kind of tie up a server, a transactional server, while you're doing this request. One early piece of feedback from the community was the idea that we have one FHIR data type, one FHIR resource type per file. And the goal there is really just to make it easy to build different types of loaders for different types of files. So if you're loading into analytics platform, you might want to load observations one way and load clinical conditions a different way. And so having them in different files, obviously you could parse the files out, but it makes it easier to do that in a streamlined way. And then the kind of last goal around handling large data sets was to make sure that we can handle streaming data, so that you don't have to load the entire data set into memory to parse it, but you're able to read and write it kind of incrementally in a pretty computationally efficient way. And then, as I mentioned, we wanted to get this moving pretty quickly, so we have a very focused scope for the first version. The first piece is around legal agreements. So this is really a technical standard, and so we're assuming that if two partners are exchanging bulk data, they have legal agreements in place to be able to share that data. So in the US, that would mean a business associates agreement, probably, service level agreements, data use agreements. There are some neat projects around trying to standardize some of these agreements. The federal government in the US, the ONC, is working on a trusted exchange framework, which will probably have some components around standardized agreements, or potentially. It's still pretty early. But that's not part of kind of the core spec here. Another thing that's kind of been pushed off for future versions is any sort of real-time data. So the idea here is that you have periodic batch data updates between these systems, again, kind of mirroring the way most of healthcare works today when you're transferring data between organizations or between large systems. But the caveat there is that you can still use the existing FHIR API to supplement that data. So if you go back to like the care management system I mentioned at the beginning, and you want to and you load the data nightly, if you have a patient that comes in, you can do a FHIR query against that organization's FHIR server to see if there have been any new encounters or FHIR resources created in the last day. And that's, again, like a very lightweight query, because you're not pulling down the patient's entire history or the entire history for all patients to create a population view. You're just kind of filling in the gaps. So that gives you a little bit of the best of both worlds. As I mentioned, we're looking at data transformation as really being a module that uses the API, but not built into the core API. And so the idea there is there's a lot of flexibility in creating these pipelines to create clean data on the output, but not everything has to have an API method. And then the last piece of scope that I wanted to point out is around patient matching. So we're not addressing this directly. It's kind of a huge headache, certainly in the US, where we don't have a national patient identifier. Some of the ways people are doing it, though, around probabilistic matching, where you kind of squish together a bunch of demographic data and try to find similar patients who have similar demographic data, those will all still work if you pass the demographic data through FHIR. And similarly, if you have, for example, an insurance subscriber number, that'll also get passed through the FHIR data for that patient. So the existing matching methods still work. We're just not addressing it directly with any sort of new technology here. So I wanted to talk about, kind of in a little bit of detail, what a bulk data request looks like. And as I mentioned, this is still pretty early days of the spec, so some of this could still change. But I think it's worthwhile walking through it. And then Josh will show some demos of the tools that can actually do some of this and how this works in practice. So it starts with a kickoff request. Here on the left, we have a back-end service. So you could think of that as like a nightly job that might run to pull data into a system. And then we have the bulk data server, which is the system that's going to be exporting the clinical data. That's likely an EHR at this point, although it could also be a data warehouse or a claims warehouse, a claims data warehouse. So there's a lot of options there. So it starts with a kickoff request, which is a FHIR operation request from this client. And when I say client, it's the client of the bulk data server, but it's probably a server in its own right, or a job that runs on a server. And so we define three kind of initial operations for the $ export operation operator. The first is all data on all patients. So that would be at the root kind of patient compartment level. You're saying, I want all data that the system has for all patients. And again, it's all the data that the system is able to export as FHIR. And so it might not be the same for every system, but it'll be what that system is mapped into FHIR Resources. We also have an operation for data on a group of patients. The idea here is that in the EHR, you might define a cohort of patients for a research study or a set of patients who are members of a particular payer, a particular insurance plan. And so those are defined using the FHIR group resource, and then you can query to kind of do this bulk export by that group. The last one is one that was suggested by the community pretty recently, which is all data in the server. So that would include things like terminology FHIR resources, which aren't directly linked to a patient, possibly some providers and organizations that don't have patients in your export. And the idea there is if you wanted to do an export of all your data in a FHIR system so that you could maybe move to a cloud-based FHIR server or put the data in a research database, it's just kind of everything that's in the system. And then the last piece is this is kind of the magic sauce. It's that if you put a header in that says respond async, then the FHIR server knows to treat this as an asynchronous operation. So the $export operation has been defined to really be only async because we're talking about large amounts of data. But one of the neat things that the FHIR infrastructure group has been working on is pulling this async operator or this async header out of the bulk data operation and enabling servers to apply it to all FHIR operations. So it's becoming a FHIR primitive as of FHIR release 4. We need to work on the documentation a little bit, which we'll do later today and this week. But the idea is that you should be able, if the servers can choose to support async operations for kind of any FHIR query. But what we're defining with the $export operation is a core set of queries that have to support this parameter. As I mentioned, there's like a pretty narrow scope to this API, and so these are a few of the parameters you can submit with any of these kickoff requests. The first is output format. Currently, we're kind of requiring a base format called ND-JSON, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But there's a lot of interest in some binary formats like Apache Parquet and protocol buffers. And so servers can certainly support that using the output format, and then we'll have discussions about whether that should be a kind of a core requirement of the spec going forward. I think the really key parameter is the _since parameter, which lets you request only FHIR resources that have been modified since a particular day. And so the use case for that would be if you had a job that ran every night, you want to only pull the things that have changed since the last time you run that job. Of course, if you leave that out, you would get all the history back as far as the FHIR server supports. And then type, we allow the request to restrict which FHIR resources it wants. So if you're, for example, if your application only requires data on vitals, you might filter that to just be FHIR observations rather than also getting demographics and conditions and other things. And then the last piece is that group ID, which isn't exactly a query string parameter, but is the other way to kind of narrow your data results. So that once the client has, or the backend service has submitted this kickoff request, the bulk data server responds with a location URL. That location can then be pulled for the status of the operation and can also be used to cancel the operation by sending a delete request to it. So let's poll for that status by hitting that content location. In this case, here's the response we got back, a 202 accepted header saying that the server is acknowledging that and the job is in progress, and then some sort of string indication of progress. This is really useful for showing to people or logging. It's not standardized because different servers may have different ways of knowing the status. So a server may only be able to say, I've handed that off and the job is running, or it may be able to say it's 50% complete or that I've done 100,000 of the resources. But we wanted to leave this flexible for now so that different servers can kind of provide as much information as they're able to. But that's one area where we're open for community input on whether that's sufficient. But then in terms of a quantitative way of assessing how close the server is to being done, we also recommend that servers reply with a retry after header. In this case, it's saying that the server expects the job to be done in 120 seconds, and that's a good time to pull back and see if it's done. And that's, again, just to keep the clients from kind of hammering the server to repeatedly polling. So if we try that request again, this time we get a 200 OK status, meaning that the job is done. as well as a body of the request that provides information on the output of this job. So on line 1 here, you can see we get a transaction time. That's the time the server thinks the job is as of. And that's important if we wanted to then use that since parameter the next time that we do a request. That would be where we would start from to get data subsequent to this. It mirrors back your request in line 2. Line 3 is interesting. This is all authenticated, and I'll talk really briefly about the authentication kind of in a minute. But the actual output files may or may not be authenticated. So you could imagine within a healthcare institution, the server might just dump them on a file server, in which case you wouldn't need your OAuth token to access them. And whereas if you're, for example, accessing a server and you're an external party, you probably do need that authentication token to be able to, or authorization token to be able to get these files. And so that's what that requires authentication token property says. And then in the output section, you get a list of the files by resource type. As I mentioned, you can have more than one file per resource type, but not more than one resource type per file. That's always hard to say straight, but I think I got it. So in this case, we have 2 patient files and 1 observation file. And these are files of all the FHIR resources that we've exported. And we'll talk about the FHIR file format in just a sec. The last piece I want to point out is a recent addition to the spec, which is that, of course, a server can return an error instead of this response body. And just say, and it would be a FHIR operations outcome that says, I couldn't process your request. But in some cases, the server may want to process the request, but put in a few errors that say, oh, I couldn't find this data for this patient. So it doesn't want to throw out the whole request, but wants to give feedback to the user that it's left out some of the data. And so we have an error section where the server can have 1 or more operations outcome files that list these errors. And the reason it's segregated into its own section is you could also have operation outcomes that are stored on the server, which would be the primary output, that aren't related to this particular error. So there's a little bit of potential confusion there, so we created a separate section of the JSON response. And then the server can kind of query to get these files and retrieve them. I'm not going to talk really about what a FHIR resource is here. Hopefully, at this point in the conference, everybody has some familiarity. But if not, there are lots of people who would be happy to chat about that. But I will talk briefly about what the ND JSON format is. It's really pretty simple. It's new line delimited JSON. The parts in red here would be the parts of the normal JSON response that wouldn't show up. So it's not wrapped in any sort of array. In a bundle, there's a lot of metadata around it. It's not wrapped in that metadata. There's no comma between each resource. They're new line delimited. And the nice thing about this is that as you parse the file, you can read the data. You don't have to worry about what's coming next. As soon as you hit a new line, you know that's one FHIR resource. And similarly, when you write a file, you can write 1 line at a time in a streaming way without having to load the entire data set into memory. But each line of this file is actually just a standard FHIR JSON resource, which is neat because you can use all the existing tooling to validate it, to generate it, the existing FHIR mappings. So you get a lot of FHIR infrastructure, but by pulling it out of the bundle, it simplifies the parsing and the generation. And it also compresses really nicely because there's a lot of repetitive text. So you get smaller files than you might expect using this. And then, of course, if you wanted it in protocol buffers or in a different binary format, you can use a loader to kind of pull it into that format from ND-JSON. Question is whether we also want to support that natively, and that's still an open question. In terms of authorization, I'm not going to talk about that too much in the interest of time, and it's also kind of moving very fast. But the idea is really that it's a public key authentication using an OAuth profile that Josh worked on for SMART, and it's currently getting a lot of community input. But the idea is that you pre-register either a public key or a location for the public key, where if you want to do key rotation, and the server, and so the client would then create a token, sign it with its public key, send that to the bulk data server, which would return with an access token, a short-lived access token. When that expires, the client can then kind of request a new token. So it's a pretty simple OAuth process relative to kind of the user process where they log in, but it doesn't require kind of user interaction in the middle post-initial setup. And of course, there are standards around having that be automated too. But we kind of imagine, at least initially, there would probably be business analysts and legal agreements involved. And so you would set that up as part of that process. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Josh. We've kind of built a lot of reference implementations and tools. And Josh has been working on a neat client that uses some of the Google infrastructure. So I'll pass it along.
All right, thanks. So yeah, I want to give you a sense of some of the community efforts that are happening around the specification, both in terms of using the spec and generating feedback and demonstrating where it works, but also in terms of providing feedback directly into the community. So first, I want to show you just a couple of tools that the SMART team has built out of the box. One of them is a server that anyone can use who wants to build a client. This is a server that is hosted publicly, available on the web. Anybody can try it out, and it plays the role of a smart bulk data service. You can also run it locally using a Docker container if you want to just try out some things without needing to be online. And let me just switch to the right tab here. So the server lives at bulk-data.smarthealthit.org. And the way that it's set up, you can configure it to know about your client automatically just using this web form. And it plays a little trick. It's actually a stateless service. So you tell it about your client, and it then bakes all the information you tell it into a URL that you can use to communicate with this service. And the cool thing about that is you can go here and you can either paste in information about the public key that you want to use to authenticate your client, or you can click a button here and have it generate a public key and a private key for you. And this is really just for testing purposes, so there's not really a deep security issue here, but it'll generate one right in the browser that you can use locally if you don't have your own key that you want to start with. And then you can configure a couple of details about how this server will behave. And the most important one is you can actually configure this server to represent many different sizes of database. So you can tell it to act like a server with just 100 patients in its database, or anywhere up to 1 million patients in its database. And depending on which option you choose here, it'll return more resources or fewer. And you can also configure it, just in the interest of being able to test out your client in different scenarios, to return very small files, just 10 files per resource, or all the way up to 1 million files per resource. So you can set up these various kinds of behaviors. And then once you pick all the settings you want, once you tell it about your public key, you can also tell it to simulate a certain kind of delay. So anything from 0 delay to 10 minutes delay in sort of doing the processing and export step. And then once you've chosen all those settings, what you get down here is a URL for the FHIR server that you should connect to. And so this URL actually has all the settings baked in to this very long string here that is one of the path segments. And so once you've got that URL, you can connect to the server, and it'll act just the way that you've set up the behavior using these forms up here. We also have a very simple web-based client that doesn't do the authentication piece, but you can hit the Try Sample App button right here. And it's got a client that'll run right inside the web browser where it'll connect to this server at the URL that we just generated. And you can hit the Prepare Download button, which does the kickoff request that Dan described earlier. So it sends off that request to do an export at the whole patient population level. And then it'll do that polling effort. And we've set this server up to act like a 10-second delay. So 10 seconds later, now we've got a list of files to download. So this represents the response content, that payload body that Dan showed, with multiple files, each file having resources of one type in it. So for example, here there's 5 files with claims resources in them over here, and a few more files with claims resources in them over here. And you can download these files one by one just by clicking on them. And I won't open this up just in the interest of time. But that's a very simple client and server that we've built. Those are all open source reference materials, and you can try them out on the web. I also want to give you a quick sense of some of the sort of applied servers. So we've heard in AL's keynote, and then also in the last session on working in large data sets in FHIR, it can be very useful to load large sets of data into a place where you can run arbitrary SQL queries against them. So I have a very simple client that will load FHIR JSON in this ND-JSON format into the Google BigQuery database service. And it sets up the schema. So you can see, for example, this is the patient table. And there will be links in the presentation that will take you to this same table online that you can follow along with. Let me just make sure this link actually works. So if I click through this, this should be an open access public data set This is some files we loaded with Cynthia, and you can browse through the database and read the documentation on how each of these tables is set up. And there are also some links to just some relatively rich kind of SQL queries that you can run. For example, generating reference ranges for the most common lab results, or looking at patient hypertension diagnoses. This is a query that will find, for all the patients who have high blood pressure measurements, how many of them are diagnosed with hypertension in their condition list? And it'll help highlight where those gaps might be. And I won't go through the details of it. It's about 50 lines of SQL with some liberal comments. But I will say, just in terms of the shape of this query, what it does is it builds up a few components sort of piece by piece in temporary tables inside of BigQuery. So first I find all the patients who have been diagnosed with hypertension, make a little table of that. Then I find all the patients where the observation has been made. So first the ones who have high blood pressure, then the ones who have conditions on their list. And then I define a set of blood pressure cutoff values, everywhere from 120 millimeters of mercury to 200. And then I just go and look through those different bands of blood pressure values and say, for the patients who had a measurement in each of those bands, how likely were they to actually be diagnosed with hypertension? So if I run that, BigQuery will give me a little progress here. It's got 3 stages. It just ran through a few gigabytes of data in about 10 seconds. And I can say, great, for patients who had a blood pressure between 120 and 130, we saw 164,000 patients like that, and none were diagnosed with hypertension, which is good, because that's a pre-hypertensive value. By the time you get up to 140, which is hypertension, we found a few thousand of those, and 98% of them had been diagnosed. Now, these are synthetic data, so the Cynthia generator has some very regular patterns that it uses when it's generating hypertensive patient outputs, and you can detect those kinds of patterns in an analytic query like this. But the interesting thing to say about this is it does a join between the observation table and the condition table, and you can get some relatively sophisticated behavior without having to write a whole lot of code. So that's a little bit about some of the work that people are doing to build clients, to build servers, and to demonstrate how these data can be used downstream. I want to take a few minutes and talk about next steps in terms of the development of the spec, and that should save time for questions at the end. So big picture, our goal in 2018 is to get through the point where this specification has been carefully reviewed by a number of stakeholders, where we've incorporated changes, and by the September Connectathon in Baltimore this year, to be piloting what we expect will be sort of the 1.0 release, feeding that into an HL7 standardization process that will begin next year. So we want to have locked down an implementation guide that we'll have done by the end of the year. We're not going to try to put it through an official standards process this year, but we want to set ourselves up for success in that standardization next year by working through all these issues quite early. And I'll give you a sense of what some of these issues look like. So there's a list of open questions here. And what I actually want to do with this list is take this as an opportunity to show you where the specification lives on GitHub. And I hope that if I just search for FHIR bulk data, that will give us a link to the GitHub repository. Well, fine, we'll play it this way. There's a link to the GitHub repository here under the resources list. One of the things that we've got is an open issues list. We're using GitHub issues very actively to track and work through changes. So I actually typed one in on my phone, just as Dan was giving the last part of the presentation, which was a quick naming question. But please take a look here if you're interested in the specification, see where some of these open questions are, and please feel free to share feedback. This is a great time to do it. The specification itself lives just as a few markdown files in this repository. There's one that is a list of our reference implementations, one that goes through the details of that kickoff and export request, and one that goes through the details of the security specifications. So it's organized in a relatively simple way as we put together this implementation guide. And the last thing I want to just talk about is opportunity to get involved through GitHub, as well as through chat.phir.org. We've got a bulk data stream where we strongly encourage you to come and join the discussion. The Argonaut group is convening to sort of look through and review this specification from the EHR vendor perspective over the course of this summer. And we've got baked into the slide deck here a set of links. You should have access to this slide deck as well through the bit.ly link that we shared at the beginning. And with that, let us pause and open up for comments, questions from the audience. Anything folks want to know? Questions about how this should work? What you can do with it? All right, it's lunchtime. Thanks, guys.